All right, thank you all so much for coming. My name is Krista Noble. I did my PhD at Maharishi University of Management, which was established by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And I'm a professor at 2 universities, one in Iowa, one here in Los Angeles. Before I get started, I'd like to get to know all of you a little bit. So first off, who here grew up in California? Raise your hands. Okay, a few people, very nice. Who here grew up outside of California? Raise your hands. Good crowd, very nice. And who here is conscious? Raise your hands. Great, okay, that means my talk should be relevant to pretty much everybody here. So the title of my talk is Why Are We Conscious? Solving the Hard Problem of Consciousness. But before I talk about the problem, I want to discuss what we can agree on. Everyone agrees that our physical brains support our subjective experiences. In other words, there is a correspondence between the physical processes that happen in our brains and our mental processes, meaning our thoughts, emotions, and perceptions. And neuroscientists have made a lot of progress in identifying the nature of these correlations, in figuring out which parts of the brain correspond to which types of subjective experience. You've made a lot of headway in that regard. However, some fundamental questions remain, essentially how and why. How does a material brain produce subjective experience? Why are we conscious in the first place? Because brains are made of matter, and if you look at the word matter in the dictionary, you'll find things like it has rest mass, it occupies space, it's subject to causation in time. There's absolutely nothing in the definition of matter that would cause you to expect it to give rise to a first-person point of view, a perspective, emotions, thoughts, feelings, worldviews. There's nothing inherent in matter that would cause you to think that these subjective qualities would come from matter based on our mainstream understanding of matter. So how is it that we are conscious? Why do these processes give rise to subjective experiences? What I'm getting at is called the hard problem of consciousness, that even if we successfully explain the physical processes that accompany all mental processes, we still won't have explained the origin of subjective experience. So even if we come up with a perfect one-to-one correspondence between the physical events in our brains and our mental processes, we still won't have addressed why we're conscious in the first place. How does something material give rise to a first-person point of view? We can think of some examples. If I look at a red flower, you can describe that event in physical terms, in terms of sensory impulses and neuronal impulses. However, if you do that, you won't have addressed why that flower has a rich redness to it, a distinctive characteristic, a quality that is available to me as the observer, a first-person subjective experience. And even a neuroscientist who is observing my brain waves would not be able to tell from the outside the rich redness of that flower. They would not be able to see. And so these subjective experiences do not seem to be reducible to physical terms. There's something above and beyond the physical that happens when we experience the world. Similar thing with pain. If I touch a hot stove, you can describe that in physical terms, in terms of sensory impulses and neuronal impulses. But you haven't addressed why it hurts so much, why it has that awful searing quality. And a neuroscientist studying my brain, they would have no inclination to grab their wrist and say, ouch, because they're not the ones having that first-person experience. So again, there's something going on that is not reducible to physical terms. Let's look at some quotations about the hard problem. The first one is by biologist Thomas Huxley, who wrote in 1868, "But what consciousness is, we know not. And how it is that anything so remarkable as a state of consciousness comes about as the result of irritating nervous tissue is just as unaccountable as the appearance of the jinn when Aladdin rubbed his lamp in the story, or as any other ultimate fact of nature." In other words, if you look at nervous tissue, you would never expect that to be capable of giving rise to a first-person perspective. So the fact that this happens, given the mainstream scientific paradigm, seems almost magical, like a jinn appearing from a lamp. And this problem has not gone away. We see that in 2002, philosopher Alva Noe writes, after decades of concerted effort on the part of neuroscientists, psychologists, and philosophers, only one proposition about how the brain makes us conscious, how it gives rise to sensation, feeling, subjectivity, has emerged unchallenged. We don't have a clue. So we've made a lot of progress in identifying correlations between the mental and the physical, but we haven't explained why we have a mind in the first place. This is called the explanatory gap. On the one hand, we have neurons firing, and we can study those. On the other hand, we have subjective experience. It's a feature of our everyday lives. What is the explanation between these two things? What fills in that gap? How do we go from these neurons to this subjective experience? So how problematic is the hard problem? Here I'm going to turn to a quote by philosopher Jaegwon Kim, who's a leading voice in consciousness studies. It's a little long, but I think it's worth it. Kim writes, "To most of us, a fulfilling life, a life worth living, is one that is rich and full in qualitative consciousness. We would regard life as impoverished and not fully satisfying if it never included experiences of things like the smell of the sea in a cool morning breeze, the lambent play of sunlight in brilliant autumn foliage, the fragrance of a field of lavender in bloom, and the vibrant layered soundscape projected by a string quartet. It is an ironic fact that the felt qualities of conscious experience, perhaps the only things that ultimately matter to us, are often relegated in the rest of philosophy to the status of secondary qualities, in the shadowy zone between the real and the unreal, or even jettisoned outright as artifacts of confused minds." In a nutshell, Kim is saying that scholars have often been content to minimize, reduce, or outright deny the existence of conscious experience because it doesn't fit neatly within the mainstream physicalist paradigm. And he's pointing out that conscious experiences are the only thing that make life worth living. What's the point of being alive if you don't have subjectivity? So it seems crucial to develop a deeper understanding of the nature and origin of consciousness. Let's look at a few possible solutions. First, some that have shown up in Western contexts. First, I want to talk about panpsychism. That's the theory that every particle of matter has conscious experience, at least in some remedial form. So we're not saying that particles have emotions or thoughts or worldviews, but perhaps some very remedial sense of their surroundings. This view has been associated with philosopher Bertrand Russell, physicist Arthur Eddington, and others, and it's gaining more credibility in academic circles because it would help to explain this gap, that rather than having to explain that suddenly we have a brain and out of nowhere consciousness pops into place, it says, no, consciousness has been there all along, it's been there in every grain of creation, but the more complicated the material structure, the more complicated the consciousness. So that's one approach to solving the hard problem. Another solution is called the transmission model of William James. William James was known as the father of American psychology, and he thought that consciousness is fundamentally non-local, like a field or a sea. So consciousness, he thought, was something permeating all of nature, all of reality. But it could become localized in individual brains. So he used the analogy of a radio. The radio doesn't produce radio waves. Radio waves already exist in nature, but the radio localizes them, it transmits them, and it allows us to hear these radio waves. But if you destroy the radio waves are still there. So William James thought in the same way that consciousness in its universal form is always there, but whether or not we experience it depends on the condition of the brain, the condition of the radio, to use the analogy. So just to elaborate a little on that last one, according to the transmission model, rather than producing consciousness and mind, the brain acts as an interface. It receives and filters some of the mental signals while amplifying others. The brain transmits, limits, and focuses consciousness as needed for the survival of the organism. So I want to turn to a Vedic approach to the hard problem of consciousness, which basically contains the two ideas we just used, but it puts them in a slightly different context. I'm using the word Vedic, that refers to knowledge from ancient India. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the man who brought transcendental meditation to the West, was part of the Vedic tradition. And he articulated a paradigm of the world called Maharishi Vedic science. He called it a science because it provides a technique for systematically exploring the nature of one's own consciousness. That's a transcendental meditation technique. So according to this consciousness-based paradigm, like with the transmission model of William James, consciousness is something universal. There's a field of pure consciousness that underlies all of reality. And the consciousness of individual creatures is an expression of that field. So it's this all-permeating, all-pervading field of pure consciousness that connects everything. And according to this model, when we transcend during meditation, when we experience that deep stillness, that state of no thought, everyone is experiencing that level of reality. That's the field of pure consciousness open to our own awareness. So according to this model, there's this field of pure consciousness, and Maharishi also equates this field with the unified field described by modern physics. So modern physics also talks about a field permeating everything, connecting everything. That's the source of the laws of nature. And Maharishi says, well, these two are one and the same. The source of all human subjectivity is the same as the source of the objective universe that we see. That's a broad overview of the consciousness-based paradigm. And this paradigm contains panpsychism, essentially. Maharishi writes that everything in creation is aware. Now, if that's true, I think we can safely draw the conclusion that everything doesn't have the same degree of awareness. Certainly, we would not expect an atom to have the same type of awareness as a human being. They're completely different levels of complexity. But there is this idea in the paradigm that everything has some remedial form of awareness. So how does the brain fit into this picture? Here, Maharishi provides a useful analogy that you can see illustrated up there. In the analogy, the sun shines on a glass of liquid and produces a reflection. He says that the sun represents this field of pure consciousness, the glass of liquid represents the individual nervous system, and the reflection on the glass represents individual subjective experience. So to recap, the field of pure consciousness shines on the individual nervous system and produces individual subjective experience. And you see, given this analogy, that the condition of the reflector is going to influence the condition of the reflection. If that glass is full of dirty water, you're going to get a distorted reflection. If it's nice and clean, you'll get a bright, clear reflection. This is bringing out the point that the state of our physiology is in large part responsible for the condition of our minds. If our body is exhausted, we'll feel tired. If our body is healthy, we're more likely to feel happy. So the condition of the reflection, the experience, depends on the condition of the reflector, the body, the physiology. And this is useful because it explains the mind-brain correlations that we discussed earlier. It says that, well, the reason that a change in the brain corresponds with a change in the mind is that the two are intimately connected, just as we would think in the mainstream paradigm. That any change in the reflector causes a change in the reflection, any change in the brain causes a change in the subjective experience. all this picture is adding is the existence of this field of pure consciousness underlying the brain, which is filtered through the brain to produce our subjective experience. So, solving the hard problem, a Vedic approach. We got into the hard problem by asking the question, how does the brain create conscious experience? And we found that it's extremely difficult to answer that question. So the Vedic approach is to say it doesn't, meaning that the brain is not the ultimate origin of subjectivity. It's very important, it's intimately involved in our subjective experiences, but that ultimate source is this field of pure consciousness. So this paradigm is saying that maybe the reason we can't seem to reduce consciousness to physical processes is that it comes from a source that goes beyond the physical, a source that is not physical in nature itself. And so maybe this entire attempt to reduce conscious experience to neuronal firings has been misguided. I'll close with a quote by Sir Francis Bacon, known as the father of empiricism. Bacon wrote, "The world is not to be narrowed till it will go into the understanding, but the understanding to be expanded and opened till it can take in the image of the world as it is in fact." So in other words, rather than trying to fit the world into a philosophical template that we understand, we need to have a template that accommodates the world and everything that exists in it. And that includes subjective experience. It's a feature of our everyday lives. So we need a paradigm that better addresses the nature and origin of subjective experience. And Maharishi Vedic science may provide a promising theory in that direction. Thank you.